I want to start by saying something clearly. What happened over the weekend in Venezuela wasn't a military operation. It wasn't even a policy decision in the traditional sense. It was economic warfare dressed up as counter-narcotics enforcement, executed with such brazen disregard for global markets that I genuinely sat here yesterday afternoon watching oil futures spike and thought to myself, they did this on purpose. They knew. They had to have known. Because you don't send special operations forces into a sovereign nation's oil infrastructure. You don't seize refinery control systems. You don't effectively nationalize production capacity under the guise of a drug raid, unless you're trying to send a message so loud that every oil minister from Riyadh to Moscow hears it in their sleep. And the message is this: the global oil order as we've known it for 50 years, it's over. The petrodollar consensus? Dead. The assumption that America would play by the rules of international commodity markets? Gone. And I don't mean gone in some speculative future sense. I mean gone as of 72 hours ago when Delta Force operators and elements of JSOC landed outside Maracaibo and systematically dismantled Venezuela's ability to control its own energy exports. This wasn't regime change. This was market capture. And if you think I'm being hyperbolic, if you think I'm overstating what happened, then you haven't read the leaked NSC briefing memo that hit my desk this morning. You haven't seen the internal Exxon emails. You haven't watched Brent crude climb 6% in a single trading session, while White House officials insisted this was routine enforcement. Routine. As if the largest unilateral seizure of foreign energy assets since the Iraq War is somehow routine. I've covered a lot of stories. I've sat through a lot of political theater. But this is different. Because this isn't about Venezuela. It's about every country that ever thought their natural resources were theirs to control. And before we go any further, do me a favor and subscribe. You're going to want to follow this one closely. Things are moving fast. So let's start with what we know happened. And I mean what actually happened, not the sanitized press release version the administration put out Sunday night. On Friday, January 9th, at approximately 0300 local time, multiple U.S. military aircraft entered Venezuelan airspace without clearance. That's not speculation. That's confirmed by radar logs from the Colombian Air Force, which tracked the incursion in real time and immediately flagged it to regional defense networks. The aircraft, later identified as CV-22 Ospreys and MH-60 Blackhawks, flew low over Lake Maracaibo and landed at 3 separate locations. The official story? They were targeting cartel infrastructure linked to fentanyl precursor smuggling. The problem with that story? The locations they hit weren't cartel safe houses. They weren't jungle labs. They were oil facilities. Specifically, they were the Bajo Grande processing complex, the El Tablazo refinery, and a tertiary shipping terminal that handles crude exports to China. Now, I want to read you something word for word. This is from an internal situation report filed by the on-site commander, Colonel Marcus Hayward, 6 hours after the operation began. It was part of a classified debrief that got leaked to the Intercept late Sunday night, and I have a copy right here in front of me. Quote, "Primary objectives secured without resistance. Local management cooperative once legal framework explained. Refinery output redirected per operational directive. Estimated daily throughput now under U.S. contract authority, 870,000 barrels. Duration of control, indefinite pending judicial resolution." End quote. Read that again. Under U.S. contract authority, indefinite pending judicial resolution. This wasn't a raid. This was a corporate takeover enforced by special operations troops. They didn't destroy anything. They didn't arrest anyone. They walked in, explained that under some obscure legal justification involving OFAC sanctions and asset forfeiture statutes, the United States now had operational authority over those facilities, and they started rerouting oil shipments. Within 12 hours, tankers that were supposed to head to Shanghai were turning toward Houston. Within 24 hours, Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, had lost functional control over nearly 40% of its export capacity. And here's the part that should terrify you. This was planned months in advance. I'm not guessing. I'm not speculating. I'm reading the emails. On October 14, 2025, an Assistant Deputy Secretary at the Treasury Department sent a memo to the National Security Council titled Legal Pathways for Asset Remediation in Non-Cooperative Jurisdictions. It's 17 pages long, and it's essentially a how-to guide for seizing foreign infrastructure without calling it an invasion. The memo argues, and I'm paraphrasing here, that if a country is in violation of bilateral agreements, particularly around narcotics enforcement, and if that country's state enterprises can be shown to have benefited from proceeds of illegal activity, then those enterprises can be classified as criminal organizations under U.S. law. And once they're criminal organizations, you can freeze them, you can seize them, you can operate them. Now here's where it gets worse. The memo was circulated to exactly 7 people. One of them was the Secretary of Defense, another was the acting director of the CIA. A third was a senior partner at a private equity firm called Ridgeline Capital, which, and this is publicly available information, has significant holdings in Gulf Coast refining operations that directly compete with Venezuelan heavy crude. Why was a private equity executive on the distribution list for a classified national security memo about asset seizure in a foreign country? That's not a rhetorical question. I actually want to know. But no one's answering, because as of this morning, Ridgeline's website has scrubbed all references to its advisory board, and the partner in question, a man named Douglas Terrell, has deleted his LinkedIn. But it gets worse. On November 2nd, 3 weeks after that memo circulated, the State Department quietly updated its travel advisory for Venezuela. Normally that wouldn't mean anything, but if you look at the specific language, it added a carve-out. It said U.S. citizens working in energy sector stabilization roles were exempt from the general travel ban, provided they coordinated with the embassy. Energy sector stabilization roles. That's not diplomat speak. That's contractor speak. And sure enough, if you cross-reference entry logs from the Caracas embassy, which were part of a FOIA dump last year that's still technically public, you see a spike in visa approvals in mid-November for personnel listing their employer as Hatch Engineering, which is a subsidiary of Halliburton. So let me connect the dots, because this isn't complicated. Treasury drafts a legal justification for seizing foreign oil assets. That justification gets shared with defense officials and private equity. State Department creates a bureaucratic pathway for contractors to enter the country. Contractors begin arriving weeks before the operation. And then, on a Friday night in January, special forces land, take control, and start rerouting oil. This wasn't improvised. This was choreographed. And the markets knew, or at least someone in the markets knew, because on Thursday, January 8th, the day before the operation, trading volume in crude oil futures spiked 32%. That's abnormal. That's not algorithmic noise. That's someone, or multiple someones, placing very large bets that oil prices were about to move. And they did. By Monday morning, Brent crude was up 6.3%. West Texas Intermediate up 5.8%. Natural gas up 4%. If you had advanced knowledge, if you knew this was coming, you could have made a fortune. And someone did, because the SEC is now reportedly looking into unusual options activity in the energy sector from last week, though they won't confirm that publicly. Let me read you another document. This one's an email, dated January 7th, sent from an analyst at Goldman Sachs to a portfolio manager at Bridgewater Associates. Subject line: Latam Energy Exposure. Immediate rebalance recommended. The body of the email is short. Quote, hearing credible chatter from DoD adjacent sources that Venezuelan supply disruption imminent. Time frame 72 hours or less. Reallocate accordingly. This is not public. End quote. Now, I don't know who the DoD adjacent source was. The email doesn't say. But someone with access to classified operational planning was feeding information to Wall Street 2 days before the operation happened. That's not a leak. That's coordination. And it raises the very obvious question, was this military operation designed to serve national security interests, or was it designed to serve financial interests? Because here's what happened in the 72 hours after the raid. U.S. oil companies, particularly those with heavy crude refining capacity, saw their stock prices jump. Exxon up 4%, Chevron up 3.7%, Valero up 6%. Meanwhile, Venezuelan crude, which was already trading at a discount because of sanctions, effectively disappeared from the market. The oil that was being produced was now being sold under U.S. contracts, at U.S. prices, to U.S. buyers. Venezuela, the country, was cut out entirely. PDVSA's revenue dropped to zero overnight. And the people who benefited? American energy companies, American investors, American refineries. So was this about stopping drug cartels? Or was it about cornering the market on heavy crude? Let me show you something else. This is a photograph that was posted to a private signal channel used by oil traders. It's dated January 10th, the day after the raid. It shows a tanker, the Atlantic Pioneer, docked at the El Tablazo terminal. The Atlantic Pioneer is flagged in Liberia, but operated by a shell company based in Delaware called Clearwater Maritime Holdings. If you trace the ownership structure, which took about 6 hours of digging through corporate filings, Clearwater is owned by a holding company that is, in turn, majority owned by Ridgeline Capital, the same private equity firm whose partner was on the distribution list for the Treasury memo. So the same people who helped write the legal justification for the operation are now directly profiting from it. They're loading oil onto their tankers, oil that was seized by U.S. military forces, and selling it on the open market. And this is legal, apparently. This is how we do foreign policy now. Now let's talk about what the White House has said, because the official response has been almost insultingly vague. On Sunday, the press secretary released a statement saying the operation was conducted in coordination with international partners to disrupt narcotics trafficking networks threatening U.S. national security. Notice what's missing. No mention of oil, no mention of refineries, no mention of asset seizure. Just a generic reference to narcotics and national security, as if this were a routine DEA operation. But then, later that same day, the president gave a brief comment to reporters on the South Lawn. And this is where it gets interesting, because he went off script. Someone asked him directly, "Mr. President, did U.S. forces take control of Venezuelan oil facilities?" And he paused. You can watch the video. He pauses for a good 3 seconds, looks at his chief of staff, and then says, quote, "We are ensuring that resources in the region are not used to fund criminal enterprises. If that means temporarily overseeing certain operations, then that's what we'll do." End quote. Temporarily overseeing certain operations. That's not a denial. That's a confirmation. He just admitted that U.S. forces are running Venezuelan oil facilities. He just said it out loud. And yet, somehow, the story that dominated the news cycle on Monday wasn't "President admits to seizing foreign oil assets." It was "Trump defends counter-narcotics efforts in South America." The framing is everything, and the framing is being controlled. But here's what's not being controlled: the reaction from the rest of the world. Because while U.S. media has been largely quiet, international outlets are losing their minds. Al Jazeera ran a segment calling it the most significant act of economic imperialism since the invasion of Iraq. The Financial Times published an editorial titled "The End of Commodity Sovereignty." China's state media accused the U.S. of piracy disguised as law enforcement. And Russia? Russia convened an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council to demand an explanation. The meeting was scheduled for this Wednesday. And the crazy thing is, none of that matters, because the U.S. isn't backing down. In fact, as of this morning, there are reports that additional military assets are being moved into the region. 2 guided missile destroyers are reportedly en route to the Caribbean. A Marine Expeditionary Unit is on standby in North Carolina. This isn't winding down. This is escalating. So what's the endgame here? What is the actual strategy? Because if the goal was just to disrupt drug trafficking, You don't need to seize oil infrastructure. You don't need to reroute tankers. You don't need to involve private equity firms. But if the goal was to fundamentally reshape the global oil market, if the goal was to reassert U.S. control over energy flows in the Western Hemisphere, then everything that's happened makes perfect sense. And here's the thing, it might actually work. Because what's Venezuela going to do? They can't fight back militarily. They can't compete economically. They can't even access their own oil revenue, because it's all being funneled through U.S. contractors now. The Maduro government is effectively paralyzed, and every other oil-producing country in the region is watching this and thinking, we could be next. Brazil started diversifying its reserve currency holdings this morning. Mexico's president gave a speech calling for regional energy independence. Even Colombia, a traditional U.S. ally, released a statement expressing deep concern over the operation. The message is being received loud and clear. If you have oil, and if the U.S. decides it needs that oil, international law will not protect you. And that's the part that should disturb everyone, regardless of where you stand politically. Because this isn't about Trump. This isn't even really about Venezuela. This is about precedent. This is about the rules of the international system and whether those rules mean anything anymore. For decades, the global economy operated on the assumption that sovereign nations controlled their own resources. That might have been a fiction in practice, but it was a useful fiction. It created stability. It created predictability. But if the U.S. can just walk into a country, seize its infrastructure, and call it law enforcement, then that assumption is gone. And once it's gone, anything is possible. Think about that for a second. If this operation is allowed to stand, if there are no consequences, then what's to stop the same thing from happening in Nigeria, in Kazakhstan, in Norway for that matter? If the legal framework exists, if the precedent is set, then any country with oil is potentially vulnerable. And that doesn't create a more stable world. That creates chaos. Now I want to read you one more thing, and then we're going to talk about what this means going forward. This is from a text message exchange between two mid-level officials at the Department of Energy. The messages were part of a leak that came out this morning, published by ProPublica. The date is January 6th, 3 days before the operation. Official 1 writes, "Hearing Friday is a go. Legal says we're covered." Official 2 responds, "What about blowback?" Official 1, "Calculated risk. Markets will settle in 72 hours. International noise dies in a week. Domestic plays as tough on crime." Official 2, "And if it doesn't?" Official 1, "Then we're in for a wild ride." A wild ride. That's how they're talking about this internally. Not as a serious policy decision with far-reaching consequences, but as a gamble, a calculated risk. And maybe they're right. Maybe the markets will settle. Maybe international outrage will fade. Maybe this will all blow over, and in 6 months no one will even remember it happened. But I don't think so. Because this isn't just about oil. This is about trust. And once you break trust in the international system, once you demonstrate that agreements don't matter and sovereignty is conditional, you can't just put that back in the box. And here's the irony. This might not even achieve its stated goals. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that this operation really was about stopping drug trafficking. Well, cartels don't care who controls the oil fields. They'll just adapt. They'll find new smuggling routes, new revenue streams, new ways to move product. You can't solve a demand-side problem with a supply-side military operation. It doesn't work. It's never worked. But it makes for great headlines. It makes people feel like something is being done, even if that something is completely disconnected from the actual problem. And in the meantime, what have we accomplished? We've alienated allies. We've destabilized a region. We've set a precedent that will come back to haunt us. And we've enriched a handful of private companies in the process. That's the trade-off. That's what we got. So, where does this go from here? Honestly, I don't know. The situation is still developing. There are too many variables, too many actors, too many ways this could spiral. But I'll tell you what I'm watching. I'm watching the UN Security Council meeting on Wednesday. I'm watching to see if any other countries impose retaliatory measures. I'm watching to see if there are mass protests in Latin America, which there very well could be, because anti-US sentiment in the region is already high, and this just poured gasoline on the fire. I'm watching the oil markets because if prices keep climbing, that's going to hurt consumers here at home, and that's going to become a domestic political issue very quickly. And I'm watching to see if anyone in Congress actually holds hearings on this, because so far the silence from Capitol Hill has been deafening. But mostly, I'm watching to see if anyone in power is willing to admit what this actually was. Not a counter-narcotics operation, not a law enforcement action, but a raw exercise of economic force, executed without regard for international norms, justified with legal contortions, and designed to benefit a very specific set of financial interests. That's what happened. And the fact that we're all pretending otherwise, the fact that the official story is still being treated as credible, is maybe the most disturbing part of all. Because here's the thing, this isn't the first time. This is just the most obvious time. The US has been leveraging military power to secure economic advantage for decades. We've done it in the Middle East. We've done it in Central Asia. We've done it in Africa. But usually, there's at least a pretense of multilateralism. There's at least a coalition, a UN resolution, some fig leaf of international legitimacy. This time, nothing. No coalition, no resolution, no fig leaf. Just troops on the ground and oil on tankers. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the message isn't just for Venezuela. Maybe the message is for everyone. The rules have changed, and we're the ones who changed them. We don't need permission anymore. We don't need consensus. We have the power, and we're going to use it. And if you don't like it, too bad. That's a hell of a message to send. And it's going to have consequences we can't even predict yet. Because power without legitimacy is just force. And force, over time, breeds resistance. It breeds resentment. It breeds instability. And eventually, it breeds blowback. So yeah, the markets are shocked. The headlines are screaming. The oil traders are making money. But the real story, the story that's going to matter in 5 years, in 10 years, is what this says about where we are as a country and where we're headed. And I'll be honest with you, I don't love what I'm seeing. This was always going to end badly. The only question was how long it would take. And based on everything I'm reading, everything I'm hearing, we might find out sooner than anyone expected. This is Mikael Storm. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.